Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the sources you find interesting and, well, we dive deep to pull out the key insights.
And today we have a really fascinating source. It's an 1891 article by H.P. Blavatsky herself.
Exactly, and she's discussing her own major work, Isis Unveiled, a book that's, hugely influential but also pretty controversial.
That's what makes this so unusual, isn't it? The author turning that critical eye on their own creation, especially one that had already generated so much buzz.
It's quite the paradox.
Yeah.
Here's this leading figure in theosophy basically saying, yeah, that massive book I wrote, it's complicated. And you sent this sore thin, likely wanting to unpack those complexities, the controversies, and Blavatsky's own, frankly, surprising take.
So our mission today is really to explore her self-critique, understand the context behind it.
And figure out what value, if any, she still saw in Isis Unveiled despite her, well, quite harsh words.
All right, let's get into it.
Okay.
The article actually starts with a pretty striking anecdote. Blavatsky talks about an American gentleman visiting their HQ in London.
Right. And he wanted to get Isis unveiled, but was apparently shocked by her reaction.
He remembered her calling it trash.
Which is strong. Now, Blavatsky slightly disputes the exact word. She thinks she probably said something more like, leave it alone, Isis will not satisfy you.
Still not exactly a ringing endorsement, though.
Not at all. And she follows up by saying that in terms of its arrangement, its structure, it was the worst and most confused of her works.
That's a huge admission. Makes you wonder what specifically bothered her so much.
Well, she doesn't really hold back on that front. She gives a whole list of literary flaws.
Yeah, she gets quite specific, doesn't she? It wasn't just a vague feeling.
No, very detailed. She mentions misprints, misquotations, useless repetitions, irritating digressions, the kind of things that can make dense books tricky. And also apparent contradictions for the casual reader. She even says some material just shouldn't have been in there and points to gross mistakes from proofreading alterations.
It sounds like a bit of a nightmare, the whole process. She described it as lacking system, almost like random paragraphs pulled from a wastebasket and published.
That's the quote. And she said this realization really hit her in 1881 in India, when she finally read it cover to cover years after publication.
Imagine that, reading your own famous book and thinking, oh dear.
Right. And she was consistent about this criticism publicly, even when people worried about sales. She felt driven by a, quote, higher objective than fame or money.
These errors genuinely caused her anxiety and trouble. It suggests the ideas were paramount for her, even if the execution was flawed.
She gives some solid examples, too, to show these weren't just typos.
Yes, the planet versus cycle one is very telling.
Explain that one a bit. She said it completely misrepresented Buddha's teaching.
Exactly. On page 347 of Volume 1, planet was used instead of cycle. So it read as if Buddha denied rebirth on this planet.
Which contradicted the previous page, where the intended meaning about cycles of existence was clearer.
Precisely. And she mentions similar mix-ups like planet for plane or monas for manas.
And those terms, monas and monas, they have specific meanings in theosophy, right? They aren't interchangeable.
Not at all. Monas is more the fundamental spiritual spark, while manas is the mind principle. Swapping them changes the philosophical concept quite drastically.
So these weren't just surface errors. They cut deep into the meaning.
She felt whole ideas were sometimes sacrificed to grammar or wrong word choices during editing.
Which really brings us to a crucial point she makes.
Despite all these literary criticisms.
Yes, despite tearing the form apart, she fiercely defends the content.
She insists Isis Unveiled contains a mass of original and never hitherto divulged information on occult subjects.
That distinction is key, isn't it? Bad container, valuable contents.
She was willing to take the blame vicariously, as she put it, for the literary defects, but not for the ideas themselves.
And she believed that readers who were intelligent enough to discern the kernel, who looked past the messy structure, they did appreciate it.
And critically, she stresses the ideas weren't hers. They came from her Eastern masters.
So she saw herself more as a transmitter than an originator.
That seems to be the core of her position, which adds another layer when you consider the book's initial reception.
Right, because it wasn't universally panned at first. She actually quotes several early American reviews that were incredibly positive.
Calling it monumental, praising its erudition, its unique subject matter.
So clearly, for many early readers, the novelty and the sheer volume of information perhaps overshadowed the structural flaws she later focused on.
Which makes the backlash that followed even more interesting.
Ah, yes, the enemies. She says the spiritualists were the first group to really oppose it.
Because it challenged their core beliefs about mediumship and contacting the dead directly.
And that kicked off, in her words, 15 years of ugly accusations.
The range is just wild. Immorality, Russian spy,
Chronic fraud, habitual drunkard, Pope's secret agent.
and even Satan incarnate. That's quite a list.
And she emphasizes that none of these were ever actually substantiated, despite her life being very public, like living in a glass house.
But the accusations didn't stop. Critics also attacked the book's originality.
Saying it was just a rehash of Eliphas Levi or old alchemists.
Or even more bizarrely, written under dictation from evil powers or dead Jesuits.
And that strange claim about Baron de Palm's manuscripts.
Which she debunks pretty thoroughly, pointing out he mostly left behind unpaid bills.
It shows the kind of things being thrown at her. But then there were also the claims from her friends.
Right, who perhaps, as she puts it, unwisely but kindly emphasize the connection to her Eastern teacher and other occultists.
And her enemies twisted that, didn't they?
They did, exaggerating it into a claim that the entire book was dictated word for word by invisible adepts.
Which created that trap you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. If the book has errors, then either the adepts don't exist or they're not very good writers.
It's a classic damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario when dealing with claims of higher inspiration.
So let's clarify her actual position on authorship.
Okay. She takes responsibility for the direct quotes used and for the errors, misprints, the general makeup.
But she maintains that every word of the actual information, the core teachings, came from her masters.
And she does use the word dictation for some passages. How did she frame that?
Interestingly, she tried to frame it in terms understandable to her time, referencing contemporary interest in hypnotism and thought transference.
Ah, so not necessarily purely supernatural, but perhaps leveraging psychic or psychological phenomena.
Kind of. She uses the analogy of a hypnotized person seemingly hearing the hypnotist's unspoken thoughts.
Okay.
Her argument was, if that's possible between ordinary people, couldn't an adept transmit complex ideas across distances via a strong psychomagnetic rapport?
The idea that space and distance do not exist for thought in that state.
Precisely. It was an attempt to explain the source of the material without resorting solely to, well, magic.
Given all this flack she was taking, why wait so long to explain herself?
She gives two main reasons. First, she actually agreed with much of the criticism about the literary quality of Isis. She found it justifiable.
So she couldn't wholeheartedly defend the book's presentation.
Exactly. And second, she had too much contempt for the slanderers, especially one individual in America she blames for most of the libel, to engage directly.
She doesn't name them, though.
No, she refers to their moral stench and leaves it at that. But renewed attacks finally pushed her to share the whole truth about the book's creation.
And this backstory is really quite revealing.
It is. She lays out the facts seriatim, as she says.
Point 1. Her English was very limited when she arrived in the U.S. in 1873, hadn't spoken it for decades.
Point 2. Lacked formal Western education, knew little of its science or philosophy, and was critical of its materialism.
3. She'd never written anything substantial in English or published anything at all before 1874.
4. Totally ignorant of literary rules, book prep, proofreading.
And 5. No initial plan for the book. Just a compulsion to write, starting even before she knew Colonel Olcott well or the Theosophical Society existed.
Which makes Olcott's role absolutely central.
She says he essentially Englished it, rewriting, translating her messy handwriting, dictating it back.
He even suggested a 2-volume split, science and theology, which meant more shuffling and editing.
And then there was Professor Alexander Wilder, another key figure.
Yes, a respected scholar. He recommended it for publication, did the index, corrected ancient languages, suggested quotes.
And wrote most of the introduction before the veil.
But apparently preferred his contributions noted only in footnotes, not explicitly in the main text.
Which probably didn't help clarify authorship issues later on.
Likely not. And then the proofreading disaster. Blavatsky inexperienced, Olcott busy, Wilder far away.
So it fell to other well-meaning but inexpert hands and the publisher's reader.
Leading to errors like Vivaswata becoming Viswamitra and missing index pages.
And those errors stuck. Because the printing plates were set, she didn't have money for revisions, and the publisher was happy enough with sales.
It paints a picture of a very challenging, almost chaotic birth for the book.
Which brings us to that plagiarism charge against the introduction.
Yes, wholesale plagiarism was the accusation regarding Before the Veil.
Blavatsky denies it, flat out, says she'd admit borrowing if she had, but didn't. She even notes plagiarism accusations were kind of common then, citing Longfellow.
But then she reveals the key piece. Professor Wilder wrote the specific part being attacked, the Platonic portion.
Pages 11 to 22. And she argues it's absurd to accuse a scholar like Wilder, known for editing classical texts, of plagiarism.
She speculates maybe he forgot a citation or his handwriting was misread.
Her point being,
Yeah.
yes, there are errors in Isis, maybe even uncredited bits, but she can't be held solely responsible in the usual authorial sense, especially for Wilder's section.
Right. It complicates the whole notion of authorship for this specific work.
So she wraps up her defense by reiterating a few things.
The English in Isis wasn't really her English, more a translation by others.
The book was mainly for theosophists, not the general public.
And even later, with better English, she still needed others to check her writing.
Which leads to her question for you, the listener. Is it really fair to judge her writing like a native English speaker's?
She argues her real contribution was the content, the fruit of my learning and studies in areas Western science ignored.
She gladly credits Alcott, Wilder, and others for the English, the quotes, the structure.
Even for The Secret Doctrine, her later work, she acknowledges editorial help but firmly claims the core doctrine and philosophy came from her instruction.
Using that Montaigne analogy, she just provided the string that ties the nosegay of collected knowledge.
And her final potent question, is any one of my helpers prepared to say that I have not paid the full price for the string? Really makes you pause.
It does. So, drawing this deep dive to a close, Blavatsky's own take on Isis Unveiled just adds layers of complexity, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's not just a book. It's this whole saga of challenging ideas, collaborative creation under difficult circumstances, and intense controversy,
We've seen her be brutally honest about its literary flaws.
while passionately defending the core message as vital and derived from her masters,
She detailed the somewhat chaotic way it came together, the help she needed.
and faced down some truly wild accusations.
It's clear that for all its acknowledged faults, Isis remained incredibly important to her as the first major vessel for the teaching she championed. And it still fascinates and provokes today.
Which brings us to a final thought for you. Knowing how critical Blavatsky herself was of the book's form, how does that change how you might view Isis Unveiled, or maybe other influential works that have known imperfections?
Yeah, what does it tell us about that relationship between the package, the writing, the structure, and the actual ideas inside? Can flawed forms still carry profound content effectively?
Something to ponder. We definitely encourage you to explore Isis Unveiled and theosophy more broadly, perhaps now with a richer understanding of the author's own complicated relationship with her foundational text.